Thank you. So now I'm going to set out some of the context underlying the decisions that the next government will have to make at the 2015 spending review. Carl told you earlier that total spending as a share of national income under the autumn statement plans is forecast in 2019-20 to be at its lowest share of national income as seen in 1948, since 1948. Now, within that total, debt interest spending and social security spending are not falling by as much as you can see there at the end, which means that public services spending, broadly defined, is also forecast to be at its lowest in 2019-20, as seen since around the Second World War. Now, the economy has grown rather a lot since back then, and so we might think that real-term spending was an alternative measure of this. So thinking about real terms public spending per person, we can see that public spending might be brought back to only around the level it was in the early 2000s. Now, that's not to say that these cuts would be easy. On this measure, the UK has seen at most 2 years of consecutive real terms cuts, whereas the latest plans imply 10. The other thing to mention is that these are based on the autumn statement plans. And of course, the next government might decide not to implement these plans. And indeed, as I'll describe in more detail later, each of the three parties has announced fiscal rules that would be consistent with smaller cuts to departments and public services spending. For the rest of this presentation, I'm going to focus on an alternative measure of public services, namely departmental expenditure limits, or DELs. This is what the government uses to allocate spending to departments on public services. Now, at the 2010 spending review, the government set out plans for DELs for the 4 years up to 2014-15. It combined with the inflation expectations of the time, these cuts implied a real cut of 10.6%. As it turned out, inflation was slightly lower than they expected, which reduced the implied real terms cut to around 8.8%. In addition, since 2010, the government has changed its cash allocations to departments, which has actually further very slightly reduced the cut to around 8.6% up to 2014-15. Then in the 2013 spending review, the government penciled in some extra cuts to departments up to 2015-16, which means that the 5-year cut is now planned to be 9.5%. Though note that that is smaller than the original 4-year cut planned back in 2010. Now, to understand what's driving this, one really needs to know about the components of DEL. So DEL is split into two areas. There's resource DEL and capital DEL. Capital DEL makes up around £1 in every 7 spent on departments. Resource DEL covers current spending on things like public sector pay, on nurses, policemen, or teachers. Whereas capital DEL covers investment on things like roads, schools, and hospitals. Back in 2010, the plans were to cut capital DEL by much more in proportionate terms than resource DEL, by just over a quarter compared to 8.3%. Slightly lower inflation reduced the implied real terms cut, as shown by the white bars. In addition, the government changed its cash allocations to departments, actually shown here by the green bars. So you can see that the government appears to have changed its mind about cutting capital spending by quite so much. So the latest plans are for it to be cut by 13.6% over those 4 years. In contrast, the government has penciled in extra cuts to resource spending, so that by 2014-15, the end of this financial year, the plans are for 7.8% real terms cut. The 2013 spending review continued this trend in favour of capital spending at the expense of resource DEL. Actually, you can see that capital spending was increased over that 1 year, so that the cumulative real terms cut is now planned to be 11.9%. In contrast, you can see that there was an extra cut to resource DEL penciled in, so the cumulative cut is 9.1%, compared to that original plan of 8.3%. Now, so this graph shows how these allocations have been made between departments. These are the 7 largest individual departments, and the numbers in brackets show what share of overall spending each department was back in 2010-11. The original plans, so over this Parliament, the coalition has decided to protect health spending and also school spending, non-investment spending on schools, that is. This has implied much larger cuts to the unprotected areas. And even with these reallocations, you can see that this protection has had huge implications for the unprotected areas. By comparing the white and the green bars, you can see the impact of the government's reallocation of cash budgets since 2010. These both use the latest estimates of inflation. So the relative winners have been the Department for Education, Business, Innovation and Skills, and the Department for Transport. It's these three departments that have benefited from the capital packages that the government has announced, increasing their capital allocations for 2014-15. The relative losers have been the Ministry of Defence, the Home Office, and the Ministry of Justice. Those departments have seen overall an additional net takeaway because of the government's extra cuts to resource DEL penciled in since 2010. Now incorporating the extra cut penciled in the 2013 spending review, you can see that the same kinds of trends have happened than was experienced over the 4 years up to 2014-15. You can see the Department for Health has seen an extra real terms increase to its budget, and also those departments that tended to do badly up to 2014-15 also did relatively badly up to 2015-16. Now, so these numbers here just summarise what I've told you before. This is the cumulative cut over 5 years to overall resource and capital DEL. And the numbers below show how this translates into the average annual cut to these areas of spending. The coalition plans announced at the autumn statement implied further deep cuts to departments up to 2019-20. The cut to overall DEL implied by these plans is 14.1% over the 4 years up to 2019-20, compared to 9.5% up to 2015-16. This would imply an acceleration of the cuts seen over this Parliament. And as you can see, that the forecasts imply that capital spending is set to be relatively protected, increasing in real terms by 7.3%. This implies that resource DEL is forecast to be cut by 17.3% over those 4 years. And this means that that acceleration is really falling on resource DEL. There's going to be, if those plans are implemented, then there's forecast to be a more than doubling of the rate of cuts to resource DEL beyond the election. Now, I said these are the cuts that would happen if the coalition's plans were to be implemented. And that's a big if, because all three parties have been making announcements and announcing fiscal rules that could imply a much smaller cut to departments. In an election briefing note published before Christmas, we explored this in more detail. So just as an example, the Conservatives are aiming for a budget surplus, which would be consistent with £21 billion smaller cuts to departments in 2019-20. That's if they were to use all of the leeway allowed by their fiscal rule. Labour and the Liberal Democrats, as Carl mentioned, have announced slightly looser fiscal rules that would exclude investment spending from their borrowing targets. Therefore, that would be consistent by smaller cuts of up to £45 billion in 2019-20. And note, since they've excluded investment spending from their targets, that means that they could spend much more on capital DEL and still meet their rules. However, there is a trade-off. If you were to increase spending on departments by increasing borrowing, there would be a cost of debt falling less quickly, again, as Carl mentioned. In addition, the next government could announce tax increases or cuts to social security. This would ease the burden on departments. And indeed, the parties have been doing these. So in that election briefing note published just before Christmas, what we tried to do is we tried to bring together all of the announcements by the parties. So this table combines those. And what we're trying to do here is give the most generous possible settlement for departments consistent with each of the parties' announcements. This number, 14.1%, is just the number that I told you before, the cumulative cut to departments implied by the coalition's autumn statement plans. And these numbers just show those cuts in billion pounds terms, and also the cumulative cut up to 2019-20. Taking into account the parties' fiscal rules and their stated intentions, we can see that under the Conservatives, given the fact that they've announced that they would like to increase the personal allowance as well as the high rate threshold, but also cut social security spending by 12 billion, this could be consistent with a lower cut to departmental spending of as little as 6.7%. Labour, with their looser fiscal rule, could be consistent with a cut as small as 1.4%, and the Liberal Democrats, with their ambition to increase the personal allowance, could be consistent with a 2.1% cut to departments. Even these smaller cuts wouldn't be easy. They would be, remember, they would be on top of this cumulative cut up to 2015-16. So, what would these cuts mean for general government employment? Well, under the latest plans, it looks like general government employment will be cut by around 500,000 between 2009-10 and 2015-16. The coalition plans imply, as forecast by the Office for Budget Responsibility, that the extra cut up to 2019-20 could be as large as 900,000. That would mean that the government might only be just over a third of the way through the overall cut to general government employment. Putting this in historical context, this would take general government employment to its lowest level since in at least the 1970s. Now, over that period, obviously, the total workforce has been increasing. So, shown here by the green line is general government employment as a share of total employment. We can see here that by 2014-15, the government would already be at its lowest since at least the 1970s. So any further cuts would take the government below that benchmark. Now, I told you before that each of the parties could potentially ease the burden on departments, which could be consistent with lower cuts to employment. And as shown here, this is how much, the approximations to the cuts to general government employment that would be consistent with the most generous interpretation of each party's plans. So you can see there that under Labour or the Liberal Democrats, the cut could be reduced to as little as 300,000. If the next government were to try to impose further pay restraint, then that could reduce the need for cuts to general government employment. Suppose we assume instead that public sector pay would grow in line with the Consumer Prices Index, then the implied cut to general government employment could be reduced to 750,000 or perhaps as low as 100,000 consistent with Labour's stated announcements. Now, again, neither column would mean easy choices. If you were to freeze public sector pay in real terms, then that would be alongside the Office for Budget Responsibility's forecast of a cumulative 8% growth in private sector wages. So it might be difficult to hold down public sector pay by that much in that context. Okay, so finally, what could this mean for the spending review in 2015 and the departmental allocations within the total? There's a very uncertain size of the overall cut, as I've just explained. There's a huge difference, potentially, between the coalition's plans and the stated intentions of the three parties. Also, we don't yet know the exact priorities of the next government in terms of which departments they would allocate more funding to. Although all three parties have signed up to protection of the All three parties have signed up to protection of the NHS and official development assistance, and the Liberal Democrats have announced for protection of education, and on Monday the Conservatives announced their version of protection for schools. Now, protecting large areas of spending like health, official development assistance and education would have serious implications for the other unprotected departments. It would translate that overall cut into a much larger cut for the unprotected areas, as has happened over this Parliament. For example, taking the example of the Conservatives, their 6.7% overall cut to DELS, if you were to protect official development assistance and allocate increased funding for the NHS, as hinted by David Cameron, then that could imply that unprotected departments would be cut by 15% if you chose to implement the protection of school spending that the Conservatives announced on Monday. And this would compare to 12.4% if school spending had simply been cut in line with all the other unprotected departments. So the final thing to note is, since capital spending is forecast to increase in real terms beyond 2015-16, capital-intensive departments are likely to do relatively well in the next spending review. Okay, so finally, just to sum up, the cuts to capital spending by departments over 5 years are now half as large as the 4-year cut originally planned in 2010. Overall, combined with lower inflation than expected, this means that the government has not cut departments by as much as they originally planned to back in 2010. However, the autumn statement implies large cuts beyond the next election, which could have serious implications for general government employment. The final thing to note is that there are huge differences between the parties, and a lot of uncertainty over whether these cuts would actually be implemented by the next government. However, if the government did choose to maintain protections for the NHS, schools, and official development assistance, then this would put pressure on the unprotected areas. There is a real difference between their plans, both for the size and the composition of the state. Thank you.